Good morning. Today is Thursday, February 9th, 2023, and I am Pastor Crespo, Jr., the Research Librarian and Archivist for the Bronx County Historical Society's Research Center at 3313 Bainbridge Avenue, the Bronx. I am joined today by Joseph Morales, lifelong Bronxite and a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, where you served 4 years on active duty, followed by 4 years of active duty in the U.S. Navy, and you're a 14-year veteran of the U.S. Navy Reserve. And finally, you were a retired special education teacher who taught for 25 years at William Howard Taft High School right here in the Bronx. Good morning, Mr. Morales. How are you?
Good, fine. Good morning to you too.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to record your oral history for the Bronx Latino History Project. And we can start by you telling us where you were born and raised and your earliest memories.
I was born in Flower Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. Little story, my mother was, my father was a World War II veteran, and she knew she was entitled to a space in a good hospital. So she went to Flower Fifth Avenue, which is one of the best hospitals in the city at the time, and she wanted a room, and they didn't want to give it to her because they didn't want to give a room free. So she said, well, I'll tell you what, if you don't give me a room, I'll wait till I'm in labor, I'll show up, and then you'll have to give me a room. And they gave her a room. So I was born on Flower Fifth Avenue on June 24th, 1950. I spent my first 10 or 11 years living on 150th between the Grand Concourse and Walton Avenue. And at that point, we were able to move to the area that we live now in the Soundview Avenue. And on Metcalf Avenue, they tore the building down. We then moved to Westervelt Avenue in the Bronx, and it was an Italian neighborhood. And for the first couple of years, we took a lot of heat because we were only the second Latino family on the block, and the Italians took exception to that. We were ostracized, called dirty spick, and we were, the first year or two, we had to go to our old neighborhood to play. The other Latino family in the block, the Gonzalez's, eventually the daughter wound up becoming a principal of a high school in the Bronx, and but because they were Latino, they were short. Their property was sold. They got less property for money and then charged extra money. We moved into the neighborhood, and we were able to move into a house because a young man who lived there had killed him tragically. And here, these Italian people who called us dirty spicks. This house was only 3 years old, but it was infested with cockroaches. There were brand new houses. They had painted that house 3 times. And when I tell you infested, my mother and I spent the first night in the house, and in the morning we could not see the floor because of the cockroaches. We were picking them up. Here are people calling us dirty spicks, and this was a brand new house, 3 years old, and these people were calling us dirty spicks. So went to a local elementary school, junior high school, Frank D. Wellen, 135. I always get the elementary school in 96 and 97. It was on Mace Avenue. Best teacher I ever had, 5th grade, Mrs. Jennings. Went to junior high school. We were only the second Latino, I was only the second Latino kid in the school. The only other one, her name, I always remember her name was Gladys Gerscovici. And she was, I don't know what she was Latino. And spent time there. Went to Evander, and Evander was because of the area, the way it was gerrymandered. We walked right past Columbus High School, but we couldn't go there. So we wound up going to Evander, even though Columbus was probably closer. Well, we wound up going to Evander. That was in the mid '60s, and Evander. There was also during the Vietnam War, the height of the Vietnam War. To me, high school was not a very good experience. I was involved in some anti-war activities. I was a skinny kid with glasses, and I didn't really. The education I got at Evander was minimum. I mean, I really wasn't prepared for college. I got my Regents diploma and all, but when it was time for me to go to college, I really wasn't prepared for it. I hadn't been taught the kind of skills that I thought should have been taught, like study skills and reading the kinds of books that should have prepared me to go to college. But So I didn't take it very seriously. I thought I was going to go into the merchant marine or the service, and I was getting involved with anti-war activities, and I was making a little joke that I was too busy making history to study it. So my grades weren't that great. So my family found me a place to go to school in Illinois, Eastern Illinois University, and I went there for 2 years. Uh, I was kind of lost. I wasn't really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I left, went into the Coast Guard. Spent 4 years in the Coast Guard.
What year was that?
I went into the Coast Guard in 1970. So I started college in '68. Went to the Coast Guard in 1970. I served on a ship on the West Coast. Uh, where after and then I transferred to Alaska. I got to spend 17 months in Kodiak, Alaska. Uh, Before that, during that time, my best friend was killed on the ship that I was on. I wasn't on at the time. Uh, an interesting experience in Kodiak. Learned how to fly a plane and did some scuba diving up there. And time I got transferred to another ship in Virginia, the Unimac. Uh, that took me up to 1974. I went back to Eastern, got my degree, and this time when I went back, I was there because I wanted to be there. So my grades were correspondingly higher. I made the dean's list every semester on the way back. Got straight A's in my major, which is secondary education. Left, graduated in '76. They weren't hiring teachers here. Moved to Florida to spend time with my father. I hadn't seen my father. My father went to prison when I was 5 years old. I still remember the day that they came to the house on 150th Street, and the two detectives, and I guess one of his partners had ratted on him, so they went right to the basement and they found a small amount of drugs. I don't remember what it was. It was some cocaine or something, but he wasn't dealing to kids. He was dealing to other adults. So I never felt bad about that. And he went away for 5 years. By the time he came out, I was 11 or so, and my mother divorced him. Eventually, we moved from there to Westervelt Avenue, and she remarried briefly. And by that time, I had my third sister, and that got me up to that time we got to high school and so forth. After 2 years in Florida, really wasn't doing anything. I went into the Navy. Kind of a little interesting story. I had some cousins down there who had also served during the Second World War, and my cousin Mike had been telling me all these stories about how he had served on submarines and he had done all these different things. So wow, sounds good. So I go into the Navy. I put in for submarine school. I go to sub school. I get ordered to my boat, USS Casimir Pulaski, and I call my cousin Mike. I said, Mike, I'm going to be a submariner like you. He said, what are you talking about? Those are only stories I told you. I never served on a submarine. So I said, what the heck did I get myself into? But serving on a submarine was the best duty I ever had. And I was very proud to wear my silver dolphins. I did eventually did some time on a surface ship. I made a med cruise and got to see other countries and so forth.
Now, the Silver Dolphins, for those who are not veterans and don't know, that would be your submarine qualification badge?
Enlisted. It's a designation that listed qualified in submarines. Enlisted qualification. The officers wore gold, enlisted wore silver.
Right, and that's very difficult to achieve.
It was. I value that more than my master's degrees. The amount of time that I spent studying. You had to learn that submarine was 425 feet long, and you had to learn every single system on that nuclear submarine, from what the cooks did to how the reactor operated, how to draw out all of the systems, how to isolate different systems depending on damage and so forth. So it took an 8-hour board between two officers and a chief, and they would just give me questions for 8 hours about every system, draw them out, different scenarios. So, and when that was all done, then the captain pinned the dolphins on my chest. So that was a big moment. It's one of the proudest things I've ever accomplished in my life.
Thank you for sharing that. That is very, very important. And getting back to your middle school years in the Bronx, do in the, and I'm assuming would be 61 through 65?
Yeah, it was 62 to 65. It was during the time Kennedy was assassinated. The Beatles were first appearing, and we were all the guys wearing stamp out Beatle buttons and different things like that. Uh,
And that's interesting because I wanted to ask you what music do you remember from that time frame?
well, to me, I didn't really know too much about my Latino music. I was more into Motown was probably my favorite kind of, but also Simon and Garfunkel and stuff because I grew up in a pretty much in a white neighborhood. But my all-time favorite group has to be like things with people like the Supremes and Temptations and so forth. And then it was only until I got much older I was able to be exposed to my Latino music and salsa and some the old greats and.
In high school or longer than after that?
After that, actually, it was actually after that because I grew up, like I said, my teenage years were all in this Italian neighborhood, so you weren't going to hear any salsa or any of that going on in that in that neighborhood. And so my middle school again, I had one standout teacher, my French teacher, Madame Bosch. The other teachers, and it's the same thing in high school. I didn't, and I think that was one of the reasons why I got into education because I wanted to be better than what I got. I mean, I wasn't impressed by any of my high school teachers. I wasn't impressed by the education I got at Evander. I'm sorry to say it, but that's maybe I used to tell people you get what you put into it. Maybe I didn't put into it enough, but that was my experience. And I really didn't have any plans of going to college. I said I was planning on going to the Merchant Marine. I got my Seaman's papers, and I thought I was going to go into the Navy, and that's the career path. But my parents said, no, you're going to go to college, and I guess they knew best. So.
Right, right. And after your tours in both the 4 years in the Coast Guard, was it followed immediately after by 4 years in the Navy?
Those 2 years. I went back to Eastern. I got out of the Coast Guard in '74. Went back to Eastern, graduated in '76. Lived 2 years in Miami, and then went into the Navy. I got out in '82. It took me about a year to. I worked as a histology technician at NYU, thanks to my aunt, who was head of human relations down there. And then I was seeing a woman who told me, check out the Times. They're hiring teachers. So I went down there and they said they weren't hiring social studies teachers, which was my degree, but they were hiring special ed teachers. And I didn't know anything about special education. So somebody told me, well, say you want HC 30 or HC 130, something like that. I didn't know what the heck that was. Health conservation, something. They changed, special ed has changed the nomenclature so many times over the years. But I think it was HC 30, which is human conservation. So I went down there, I filled out the paperwork, and I was hired to teach at Taft, which I never knew anything about that school. So, but I was hired. First year or two, they came out with one special ed test. They never had anything like that before. Before it was just different disciplines. You had learning disabled. You had different. There was 3 or 4 different titles for special ed teachers, and they combined them in one. So there was one exam. So since there was no history of it, there was nothing specific to study. They gave me a pile that must have been about a foot thick of different exams to take this test. So I take the test, and I scored like a 73 or 74. I said, wow, that wasn't so good. But then I found out that out of the 30 people in my department who took the test, I was only one of 3 who passed it, and that was the second highest score. So, I didn't feel so bad when those 27 other people didn't even pass the test.
Right.
And so I passed it with, like I said, with the second highest grade in my department, and then I started teaching special ed. After the first year, my supervisor, Bob Stern, who passed away a few years afterwards, he got me to asked me if I wanted to work in a work study program. So I went to the local hospital, Bronx, Lebanon, and then eventually to other work study sites. And that's what I spent most of my time at Taft, being involved with work study. And then I'd come back to the school and teach 2 or 3 periods of science or math or whatever they wanted me to teach. And that was a really good experience. I mean, it was the Taft was at the time was one of the most dangerous high schools to work in the city. We had metal detectors and scanners. We had NYPD along with the local the school-based SSOs, securities people in the school. But I think we were the first school in the city to have metal detectors and scanners in the building. And I didn't have any trouble with the kids who knew me. I had trouble sometimes occasionally with kids who didn't know you because there was a lot of gangs. And but you know, sometimes they'd say things or sometimes they randomly throw things, but it was nothing ever directly. I mean, the kids who know me, I was fine, and I was fortunate enough to get an award. I have a picture of an award the kids took a collection and they gave me a nice plaque, and
That's awesome.
and that was one of the things I value the most.
Great. And the student body, can you describe them?
Well, it was again, it was mostly black and Hispanic, and there were local kids. I think 60% of the kids that I had did not live with biological parents. They lived with aunts and uncles or grandparents. So there was a lot of that, and you know, it's a poor neighborhood. Taft was in Sheridan Avenue and 172nd Street in that area, and that's what it was. I dealt with mostly learning disabled kids. I didn't have any severely handicapped kids like District 70, I think 78, or they had those kids, and they were mostly mildly retarded kids. That's what I got my master's degree, was in mental retardation, and then I wound up getting another master's plus my 30 in different related subjects, teaching math to special ed kids and so forth.
Great. And the faculty, what was that like?
We had a great faculty. I mean, we had a black principal. We had my principal, Bob Stern. When he moved on to other things, he was replaced by a woman named Shauna Schwartz, a little Jewish woman, couldn't even more than 5 foot, but nobody gave her any grief. You could see her controlling guys, big tough kids that were, you know, that had parole officers and stuff, but nobody gave Shauna any grief. She was great. She was a tremendous supervisor. And then eventually I wound up getting a female black supervisor and black female principal, and they were all really top notch. The people that I worked with were really caring people, and they were really good people.
Great. And the you know, the difference between the educational system you enjoyed during your youth compared to the education being provided at the school, how would you compare?
I got to meet other people in other departments, and to me, I wish I would have had those type of teachers. I never had them, and I was determined that I was going to be unlike the kind of teachers I had. So, because I had a special ed class and they were small, I had a rule in my class: no one is going to be picked on. No one is going to feel inferior. There was going to be no bullying in my classroom. I had a certain amount of that when I was in high school. I got into one fight with some guy who thought he could do what he was going to do, and it didn't work out too good for him. But luckily, I came out ahead on that one, my only fight. But there was going to be no bullying in my classroom, and and those kids knew that I was going to support them, and that I was going to care for them. And I got a lot of that same thing from most of the other people in my department were exceptional teachers. And the same thing in other math department and science department. Some of those people in the history department wound up teaching at Bronx Science. They were so good. And so I think we had a really good faculty in there. Considering the reputation that the school had, those kids got a really pretty good education from us, I think.
Great, great. Now, the 80s, different time from today, where today in Florida you have any education about colored people being legislatively restricted from the schools. How were ethnic studies during your teaching tenure?
One thing that I found that I was very disturbed. My first year, I was tasked to teach social studies, and I was given the history book that was to be used by were used by the school. There was the recommended history book, and I opened up the book and I look on the map in the Caribbean, and there's no map of there's no picture of Puerto Rico on the map. I mean, I was dumbfounded. I'm supposed to be teaching social studies. I'm giving a textbook that is supposed to be used by all the students in the school, general ed as well as special ed. We did our modifications, but there was no picture of Puerto Rico on the map. And I went to my supervisor, and then I eventually went to the principal. And I said, "Look at this textbook that we're given to use, and with all the Hispanics in this school, and there's no picture of Puerto Rico on this. There's no map of Puerto Rico in this textbook, and very little mention of it." And they said they were going to do something in the distance, but you know how the bureaucracy was. And I was a new teacher, didn't have tenure. They weren't going to. So I wound up supplementing my materials as we all had to do, and spending a lot of money, my own money, getting appropriate books for the kids to use, so I could teach them what they needed to know. I also was determined that those kids were going to leave the school with skills that they could use. So every special ed kid that I had left the school with a small resume. It was a simple thing because there wasn't really too much of it. But they had when they went to a job, they went with a little resume that they could take with them. I spent time teaching job skills stuff, and I never told any kid you couldn't be anything. But reality is, if you have an IQ of 55, you're not going to be a doctor. But I would never tell the kids that you couldn't be that. But I would say, well, you're going to have to be a college. You're going to go to college for 4 years, then 4 more, and so forth and so forth. And you have to go through all of that school. And usually that was enough to deter them. I said, but if you still want to work in a hospital, there are other options where you don't need to have so much college if you don't want to. But I never dissuaded them. I just pointed out what the career path and what it was involved and what they would have to do if they wanted to do that.
That is great. Now, what kind of music do you recall listening while you were teaching in the 80s? You know, what was popular in the hallways?
To be honest with you, they didn't play music in the hallways.
Gotcha.
You know, we didn't have cell phones and all the rest of that stuff was there was no boom boxes or anything like that stuff allowed in the school. All that stuff was picked up. They were pretty tight about all those things like that. And so I guess that's when I started to learn more about Latino music, and started getting into some of the Tito Puente and you know, some of the old guys, and Afro-Cuban music and that sort of stuff.
Were there any clubs or areas you frequented here in the Bronx that
No,
catered to that type of music?
I was busy work. I was busy, you know, going to school.
Great. What kind of foods do you recall eating here in the Bronx, or were part of your?
Well, my Puerto Rican, my grandmother was Puerto Rican. She was born in I always was Mayagüez, or she was born near a farm. Her father was a colonel in the Spanish Army back in the mid 1800s, and she had a farm there. She eventually, when she moved here to New York, she married my grandfather, who was a Spaniard, and my grandmother was she was interviewed in a local television station. I should have brought that picture with her. Her name was Velez. She lived to be like 107. Wow. I mean, 109. I mean, she was an amazing woman. So she cooked her Puerto Rican food. So the funny thing, I wound up eating food that I didn't even know that the bacalao was fish. Because it was always, she cooked it with the rice and stuff. I didn't even know that bacalao was a fish. Right. So she made her Puerto Rican dishes. So arroz con bacalao, arroz con pollo, pasteles. You know, I used to help with the masa making for the pasteles. She used to make one special out of rice for me because she knew I'd like the one for rice. Right. So I love our tostones. And my mother was born in New York. My father was born in Havana. But my mother was born in New York, and she had pretty didactic taste in cooking. She cooked a little bit of everything. She might cook roast beef, corned beef and cabbage one day, or shepherd's pie, but she also cooked our Latino foods, and she was a tremendous cook. So my mother was an amazing woman, and she raised the three of us basically, and her whole life was pretty amazing, like the things that she wound up doing.
And I know economically you probably didn't frequent restaurants a lot, but were there any local restaurants or food joints, Puerto Rican, Italian, that stuck out to you
When
in
I
your
was growing
memories?
up, or later on?
Growing up and later on here in the
Well,
Bronx?
we I mean, I never had a difficult childhood as far as we were always provided for. I was fortunate, even though my father was in prison. I had a good support group with aunts and uncles and my grandparents, and my mother worked. So I never, had to live in projects and go through stuff that even my wife had to go through. And then when we moved to Westervelt Avenue, we eventually had a house, and so I never had it as bad as other people had it. And I was fortunate when I was a kid. My mother was able to take us to different restaurants, and in the city once a month we'd go to a different ethnic restaurant, Chinese food, different kinds of things. So I was exposed to different types of food. And I mean, the food in the military, you know what it is. I mean, on the submarine was the best food we ever had. But uh, so there was that. When I got out of the service, uh, again, most I was married, so I wasn't eating out too much. Didn't really remember any standout restaurants. I mean, now we have some favorite ones here in the Bronx, but
You could name them.
we like the Havana cafes. We like to go to City Island and eat in the restaurants at City Island. There's some Italian restaurants on East Tremont that we go to occasionally, but now because of the COVID thing, we don't. My wife doesn't feel comfortable about going to restaurants, so we haven't gone to too many, lately. And she's a good cook, and I'm a baker, and between the two of us, so we don't really go out to eat that much anymore.
Okay. All right. And now you had mentioned you got involved somewhat slightly in a little bit of activism growing up through high school. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, and how did that, I know the 1970s were full of young lords and Black Panther Party.
Well, I was out in the '70s. I was in the service or in college, and so, but in the '60s, because I'm 72, it was the Vietnam War. My uncle Dennis Mora, who went to elementary school. It was time for him to go to high school, and the guidance counselor. Luckily, my mother, who was like 9 years older than him, went with him to the guidance counselor. And this guidance counselor looked at my uncle Dennis, looked at his last name, and she wanted to set him up with. Said, well, we should put him into a local high school and give him a general course because Puerto Ricans, quote, Puerto Ricans are better suited to work with their hands. My mother knew how smart my uncle Dennis was. He tested for Bronx science. Here, this guidance counselor wanted to send him to a local academic high school and put him in a general course when this kid tested for Bronx science, and she knew that. And Dennis wound up going to Bronx science, graduating from Bronx science, getting a scholarship to Brown University. But when he went there, and he was also a championship swimmer during high school. But when he went to Brown and he saw all these people, they were there just for the money. They were, and he thought he was full of idealism and so forth. And he decided this wasn't for him. So he wound up graduating from CCNY with a degree in history. Around that time, he was involved in the anti-war movement, and the army told him, look, if you go into service, we're not gonna send you to Vietnam. So he went in there, and they put him in a position where he had to refuse a direct order. So him and two other soldiers, a Lithuanian and an African American, Samus and James Johnson, the three of them were known as the Fort Hood Three. This was during the mid '60s. I went to Fort Dix when I was 14, 15 years old or so, and he was court-martialed. I saw him getting court-martialed, and he wound up doing a couple of years at Fort Leavenworth for refusing to go to Vietnam. And so I was involved in that kind of stuff, and then all that stuff. My mother wound up running for office under the Communist Party, and all of that stuff later on came back to haunt me when I was in the Navy. and I had put in for officer candidate school. And then all of a sudden, after I had served on a submarine and got in my dolphins, and I put in for officer candidate school, all of a sudden now they couldn't trust me, so they dropped my security clearance, and I was sent to a surface ship for my last 7 or 8 months. So that was, and as it turned out, I look back, I was a little disappointed. I had gone into service at the same time as my cousin Mike, and my cousin Mike wound up becoming an 06, which is a captain in the Navy. And but I thought, well, I would probably, I'm going to be a good teacher. I probably would have made a lousy officer. So I think it was, in the end, it worked out. But I was a little disappointed at the time.
Okay. But you used 25 years as a special education teacher at Taft High School. How did that, when did you decide to retire? How did that?
Well, they were offering buyouts, and I had because of the time I had in service, I was able to buy back 3 years. So I taught for 25 years, but I got credit for 28. And they had a buyout, and Board of Ed was offering a buyout, and it was too good to be true. So I opted to take a.
What year was that?
I retired in 2008. Yeah, 2008. And so I took the buyout with 25 years, with 28 years of credit. And it was after the dust was settled, I was making as much money. My take home was almost as much as when I was working full time. So between that, and I knew I was going to get my pension from the Navy and Social Security. So I knew I was pretty much going to be set.
Great. And these days, how do you occupy yourself?
Well, being a teacher, you have every summer you have little mini retirements, because you're going to be off for 2 months. So you have a lot of you have a lot of hobbies. So I have a lot of hobbies. Up until the COVID, I was scuba diving in the Caribbean. We were going once or twice a year to the Caribbean. So I was scuba diving all over the Caribbean, doing my underwater photography. And now I'm into photography pretty much big time, and I mostly wildlife photography. I go to the botanical gardens, take pictures of birds. So I have my photography. I also have an outdoor railroad garden, like the kind they have at the size scale that they have at the botanical gardens when they have the train shows every year. Mm-hmm. I have those size trains, so I have a layout in my yard that's pretty good size. So I have my model railroading. I do my gardening. I bake. I turned out to be a pretty good baker. Do a lot of reading. So those are.
What neighborhood do you live in now? And can you kind of describe your neighborhood?
I live in Clawson Point. It's called Harding Park. They call it Little Puerto Rico. The houses are, most of the people in my neighborhood, all my neighbors are now either Hispanic. We have a couple of black people who moved into the neighborhood, but the vast majority of the people in the neighborhood are Hispanic. When I moved in there about 35 years ago, the city, it used to be the area of the community was the houses were owned by the city, but then they wind up selling it to those associations so people could own their houses. It used to be there were summer cottages. So we moved into my second wife and I moved into a little house we have, and we thought, well, we're only going to be here for a short time. We're going to use this as a starter home, but their interest rates were like 13% at the time for a house. And we got divorced, so I've been there ever since. And the neighborhood's gotten, if anything, it's gotten even a little nicer. So I'm blessed with some really great neighbors, and it's pretty quiet over there. Matter of fact, a couple of years ago, Reader's Digest came in there and they did a little piece on it. So one of the best neighborhoods in the city, or in the country rather. So that was in the Reader's Digest a couple of years ago.
Okay, it might be a silly question, but Little Puerto Rico. Tell us how it got that name, if you know, and does it still qualify today?
Well, it got its name because the houses are small, the streets are narrow. So I live on a corner, so I don't have any problem with that. But because a lot of people most of the people in there speak Spanish, and like I said, the houses are small and the streets are small, like there is in like in San Juan or some of the other cities. So you're likely more likely you're going to hear salsa or some other merengue or something like that than you're going to hear any other kind of music. So I guess that's how. Then it's if anything, it's gotten uh, more Latinos have moved into the neighborhood, and luckily, I mean, the professional people. My next one of my best friends is an electrician next door. Another one's a teacher. We have a lot of cops coming to living in the neighborhood. A lot of veterans are living there. Two of my best friends are veterans, and
Any type of events or festivals go on in Little Puerto Rico?
well, they haven't had they a few years ago they had uh, there used to be an an indigenous people group of people that came in and had some kind of a function there a few years ago. But it never on Christmas time they go around the associate homeowners association they go around singing Christmas carols in Spanish, and they do that. But other than that, it's not.
More like a paranda.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Great, great. So during the holidays, the Spanish music will kick up, Spanish type holiday music.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty quiet for the most part. People are considerate for the most part. We've had some incidents and people from other outside of the neighborhood coming in there and creating a little problem. But basically, it's pretty quiet. It's pretty safe. And from my yard, I can see LaGuardia and Hunts Point, and I can go sit on the rocks, even though people come in and throw a lot of trash down there, and it's a really it's sad. I've gone in there, I don't know, and removed I don't know how many bags of trash, but it's people, like I said, come out in the neighborhood and they just leave garbage all over the place. There's no stopping it, and that's pretty sad. It's such a nice little place. You can go sit on the rocks. People go fishing there, and you can see LaGuardia, and you can see the skyline of Manhattan, which during 9/11 you could see the towers. You could see the towers from where I live. You could see the new one. You could see the smoke coming up from the pit, and so. But now you can see the skyline, and it's pretty nice over there.
Is there anything you'd like to talk about that maybe I didn't touch on? Anything you'd like to elaborate on? I know you brought a high school yearbook with you.
Well, this is from from a Vantage House from '68. It's kind of marked up a little bit, but I've had it all these years, and I figure I donate it to the society because at some point I'm not going to be around, and my family's going to look at this and say, well, what am I going to do with this? And I'm going to throw it in the garbage. And I thought maybe you guys might like to have it. So
Definitely.
and it's interesting. It's
And the mascot name on the front?
it was
The school name?
Tigers, but the book's name was it was a panther, a tiger. The orange and black was a tiger, but the book name was Oriole, which is kind of interesting because when I went to college, the college yearbook was called the Warbler. So here I was the bird photography, and both yearbooks, one was named after birds. So I was kind of
Interesting.
So there's that. This is one of the greatest things I was able to do a number of years ago was to take my granddaughter or my granddaughters, get her scuba certified, and we went scuba diving together in Bonaire, which is in the Dutch Antilles. People have heard of Aruba and Curacao, but Bonaire is a small island right next to them, and we went scuba diving when I was about 65 and she was about 14. So that was a lot of fun. This is a plaque that was given to me by my students, and one of the things I told my wife, well, I'm going to get cremated, but I was going to put that in a box with me, but I guess that ain't going to happen now. But that's one of the things that I was proud of. And this is a picture of me when I was in the reserve when I just made E6.
There you go.
That was about my mid 40s.
And I know the intelligence specialist would be IS6s. What would your rating be?
Well, I was a machinist mate, And on a submarine, I was an auxiliary. We worked on all the systems that weren't electrical, that didn't have to do it directly with the nuclear power plant, hydraulic system, air conditioning, refrigeration. When I went to the surface ship, I was in main propulsion, working on steamships, on the main engines and stuff like that. But I was a machinist mate first class.
Great. MM1.
Right, MM1, machinist mate 1.
Great. And what does the Bronx mean to you?
It was always a place to come back to. I mean, I've been traveling all over the place. I had lived in California, I lived in Alaska, I lived in Florida, I was stationed in Virginia, I went to college in Illinois. But this is where my family was. This is the place to come back to. And most of my family is gone now. A lot of them are living in Florida. But this has always been the place to come back to.
Right. And would you like to say anything to close out the interview?
No, I don't think I've done anything special that anybody else couldn't have done as far as education or the military. This is the path that I chose. I don't think there was. Like I always say, I made some dumb decisions in my life, but I made more intelligent decisions. And I'm here, and anybody else could do it. It's just a matter of applying themselves and deciding this is what they wanted to do. But I don't consider myself to be exceptional in any particular way.
Yeah, you know, serving in the Coast Guard for 4 years, and you know, I'm going to have to praise you a little. You know, back to back, and serving 4 years in the Navy, and then to continue with 14 years in the reserve, to continue that dedication and sacrifice, and your sacrifice here to the city of New York and the borough of the Bronx, teaching special education in the 80s through 2008. Remarkable achievements, Mr. Morales. I appreciate it. I know the Bronx appreciates it. And thank you so much for sharing your enlightening life story of living in the Bronx.
Well, I'm glad to do it. And if it's can be of any help to people in the future, it was worth it for me to spend a little time to do this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.